My mum is Bradosti. Her family was living in a small village near Hauler, and in 1975 their village was attacked by chemical weapons, killing her mum and two younger siblings and disabling her father. So as a result, my mum became the head of her family and helped get her siblings and her disabled dad out of Kurdistan and into Iran, where they sought refuge. My dad's family is Kurdi, and in the 1980s they also fled and sought refuge in Iran. So eventually my parents met in Iran. They were both active in the Kurdish Democratic Party, and they met as teenagers on some of the work that they were doing. They spent their life in Iran, got married and had two children, and eventually things became very unsafe for the Kurdish people living in Iran, and so they had to flee again. This time they fled to Pakistan and they sought asylum. They were told that it would be 6 months before they were resettled somewhere safe. They arrived in 1989, and it was almost 10 years later that family left. So I was born in Pakistan in a refugee camp in Quetta, and I spent my childhood years growing up in Pakistan. Then in 1998, we received news from the UNHCR that we were being resettled to New Zealand. We had no idea where it was, but we knew that it was going to be somewhere safe. So my family moved to New Zealand in 1998. I was raised by many stories about my parents and the struggles of the Kurdish people, and I was always very interested to learn more. After the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, my mother and I went to Kurdistan for my first time. I was 13 years old, and I went to Kurdistan for the first time, met my grandparents, met my extended family. I had to cross 3 different borders to see all my family. Some of my family was living in Bashur, some were living in Bakur, and some were living in Rojalat. So we had to cross from Iraq to Turkey to Iran to see them all. And during this time, I noticed the Kurdish flags raised in the Kurdish region of Iraq. And I noticed that the same was not true in the Kurdish region of Turkey or Iran. And one particular event I recall vividly was when I was in the Kurdish region of Iraq. I had purchased lots of souvenirs, flags, Kurdish CDs, Kurdish posters, lots of things with Kurdish identity on them. And so when I was traveling from Iraq into Turkey, all of these souvenirs and Kurdish flags and maps were confiscated by the Turkish officer. And I was really confused. I didn't understand why, and I wanted to understand. I was asking questions, and my mum literally had to drag me away from the Turkish officer when I was questioning why my things were being taken. I was really young, but even at that moment I realized that something was not fair for Kurds, and that something needed to be done about it. So this trip really changed something in me. For the first time, I wanted to know even more about my Kurdish identity. So I researched and I found out about all the injustice the Kurds have suffered, the persecution, the Kurdish genocide, and it made me feel just so powerless, and I wanted to do something about it. So throughout school, I would always think to myself, what could I do? What could someone like me on the other side of the world do to help the Kurdish cause and to fight for Kurdish rights? And the situation that I was born into motivated me towards humanitarian action, justice and equality. I had learnt about injustice and the denial of human rights long before I knew what those concepts legally meant. And so I wanted to use my skills to fight for others so that they could have a voice and fight for justice. And I thought to do that, a career in law would be my way to fight for justice. All throughout high school and law school, I volunteered with organizations that focused on human rights and refugee issues. So as young as 14, 15 years old, I was volunteering with the New Zealand Red Cross to help refugee families that had just resettled to New Zealand. I was involved with UN Youth and Amnesty International and all the organisations that really fought for human rights globally. And then as I got older and was able to take more opportunities and responsibility, I became really involved in the refugee community in New Zealand, and that was mainly through my role as a youth advisor and the deputy chair of the Red Cross National Youth Panel, which gave me many opportunities to advise on youth issues for New Zealanders and also youth issues globally. In 2016, I was part of the Global Refugee Youth Consultations, which were the first ever consultations which brought together young refugees from all around the world and basically let refugee voices be heard for the first time on a global scale about the issues that young refugees faced, the challenges that they encountered, and the solutions that they thought would counter some of these challenges. And so a group of young 32 refugees met in Geneva, and we established the Global Refugee Youth Consultations and advised the UNHCR on the issues that young people face and how we could address these. The Global Refugee Youth Consultations led to the establishment of the Global Youth Advisory Council to the UNHCR, which is now an entirely youth-led council that advises senior officials, the UNHCR, the High Commissioner, on issues that young people face in the refugee context all around the globe. The feeling of graduating from an institution like Harvard Law School is incredible and surreal. I remember the first time I visited Harvard Law School's campus. I was one of hundreds of tourists walking around the campus, taking photos. And I remember going into a classroom that happened to be open and taking photos, pretending to be a student, because the idea of studying here seemed so ridiculous and not possible for someone like me. And I remember sitting out at the Harvard Law School sign, and there was someone walking past, and I asked them to take a photo of me. But while he was taking the photo, he asked, "Do you go here?" And I remember at that moment, trembling with fear, my voice shaking, I responded to him saying, "No, but I will." And at that moment, I decided that I would do everything in my power to come back, and this time as a real student. And I think it's not just because of the amazing institution it is, but it's everything that it represents. For me, what was really important was all the barriers, the stereotypes, and the assumptions that I wanted to crush, and to prove that people like me, Kurds, marginalized groups, minorities, refugees, could dream bigger than the constraints of their identity and experiences allowed, and to empower others to do the same. So I guess graduating from Harvard Law School is not just for me, it's for my parents who fled everything and sacrificed their lives so that we would have a better future. It is for my Kurdish people that are still to this day fighting for self-determination, and it is for the voiceless young refugees all around the globe who motivate me and inspire me to work harder every day. I think my advice would be that you have the potential to achieve whatever it is that you want to achieve. Wherever you may feel held back, there lays an opportunity to break barriers and to create a new path for yourselves and exceed expectations. So dream big and don't let anything hold you back. Crush the barriers and go for what it is that you dream of.